So, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. For those who don't know me, I'm Sabine Schmidtke, the permanent faculty at the School of Historical Studies representing Near Eastern Studies, and co-hosting today's webinar with me is Maria Mercedes Tuya, representing Digital Scholarship at the IAS.
We're very glad you can join us and hope you are excited as we are from having the opportunity to embark in what promises to be a fascinating journey and much to learn.
Mm-hmm. And it's a great pleasure for me now to introduce today's speaker, Professor Thomas Carlson, who will talk to us about opportunities and challenges for indexing a polyglot society, the development of the historical index of the medieval Middle East. Thomas Carlson is an associate professor at Oklahoma State University and a member of the School of Historical Studies here at the IAS during the current academic year. In his scholarship, Thomas focuses on the religious and ethnic diversity of medieval Middle Eastern society. His first book, Christianity in 15th Century Iraq, 2018, highlights the cultural continuities, social contexts and conflicts, and strategies of differentiation among Christians, Muslims, and Jews in 15th century Iraq and Al Jazeera. It challenges the normative Eurocentrism of studies of non-European Christianity, as well as the Islamic exceptionalism, which still leads most experts to ignore the non-Muslim presence in much of the Middle Eastern history. His current book project explores the social impact of Middle Eastern religious, ethnic, and linguistic diversity in the Islamic Middle Period. Today, Professor Carlson will speak about his digital history project, the Historical Index of the Medieval Middle East, yet another step towards a new historiography of the Middle East during the pre-modern era. Thomas will speak for about 45 minutes, and this will leave us a little time for discussion in the end.
I have some housekeeping rules. We would please appreciate if you keep your microphones muted during the presentation. You can add comments or questions using the chat function during the presentation or at the end, and we will address them all when the presentation is over. And now, without further ado, Thomas, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Sabina, for the introduction, and thank you, Maria, for organizing and publicizing this event. I will attempt to share my screen. Is that working?
Yes.
Great. So let us begin with a murder mystery that was only solved recently. In 1129 CE, politics in Damascus were deadly serious. Under the rule of the Atabeg, Taj al-Muluk Buri, the vizier was favoring an Ismaili faction, which was solidifying its power when a Crusader army arrived to lay siege to the city. During this crisis, the vizier was killed, reportedly on the orders of Buri himself. But to whom did the ruler entrust this murder? Our main Arabic sources for the history of Syria in this period, Sibt ibn al-Jawzi and ibn al-Qalanisi, both mention the murder but do not name the perpetrator. A Syriac source, the Chronicle of Michael the Syrian, in fact directly identifies the murderer, although unfortunately the name has been corrupted by Syriac scribes into Suj ad-Dawla bar Sufi. This meaningless name mystified the French and English translators of Michael's text, but in correspondence with Paul Cobb, I learned that the Banu Sufi were a notable family including mayors of Damascus. I was able to recognize this as a deformation of a name, which Ibn al-Qalanisi mentions elsewhere, al-Mufarrij Abul Duad ibn Sufi. He opposed the Ismaili faction and stood to gain from the removal of the vizier, and indeed the following year, he became Buri's vizier in his turn. While his involvement in the murder is a small detail, comparing Arabic historical sources with a Syriac chronicle sheds light on the deadly urban politics in Burid Damascus under threat from a Crusader army. This detail was missed by earlier Islamic historians who neglected the Syriac source, whereas Syriacists have not usually evinced much interest in the Islamic political history embedded in this text. A piece of harsh medieval political reality slipped through the gaps of modern scholarly subfields, which reflect divergent origins and interests rather than the integrated society of the period. In 12th century Damascus, one might have heard Arabic, Greek, Turkish, multiple varieties of Aramaic, and probably also Kurdish, Armenian, Persian, and Latin. The medieval Middle East was a region of astonishing linguistic, ethnic, and religious diversity, as many of you have heard me discuss before. Here, I simply want to emphasize the plenitude of literary traditions. Arabic was, of course, used by the Muslim elites for both courtly and religious texts, while the religious groups that were conquered by Muslims continued writing literature in languages such as Aramaic and Hebrew, Armenian, Caucasus Albanian, Coptic, Georgian, Greek, Mandaic, Pahlavi, and Syriac. Over time, Jews and Christians in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq increasingly adopted Arabic, while Jews, Zoroastrians, and Muslims in Iran increasingly wrote in Neo-Persian, what we now call Farsi. Greek and Armenian continued to be composed in Anatolia and the Caucasus Highlands, while Ethiopic Ge'ez was revived in the Horn of Africa. Coptic, Mandaic, and Pahlavi ceased being composed, though they were still copied in the later medieval period, while Caucasus Albanian disappeared completely. The influx of Turks from the east introduced multiple dialects of Turkish and spread Neo-Persian across Anatolia, while incursions from Frankish crusaders from the west brought Latin and various vernacular Romance languages into the region. Mongol and Uyghur were briefly written in the Middle East due to the conquests of Chinggis Khan's descendants, while Latin faded with the end of the Crusader states and Syriac, Hebrew, and Jewish Aramaic were greatly diminished. I want to emphasize that this map includes only literary languages. If one were to try to include all spoken languages, it would be simply unreadable. If anyone knows of a comparably sized region in the pre-modern world where more distinct writing systems were used, I would like to hear about it. By contrast, scholars have segregated the medieval Middle East into subfields divided by language and religion. Arabists, Syriacists, Armenologists, and Byzantinists most often focus on one language each, sometimes supplemented with the backup language. Islamicists usually include both Arabic and Persian, Turkologists, Persian, and Turkish. Crusader historians are increasingly supplementing their mainstays, Latin and vernacular Romance languages, with Arabic, and polyglot Judaicists read Aramaic, Hebrew, and Judeo-Arabic. Mongol historians confess to reading primary sources in translation, perhaps a model for all of us, and they form scholarly collaborations to deal with the linguistic complexity of an empire that spanned the width of Asia. Very few scholars read more than 3 languages out of the more than a dozen that I mentioned earlier. Houston, we have a problem. No Americanist would claim to understand Miami while ignoring the Spanish language sources. But what else can we do when the linguistic proliferation of the medieval Middle East exceeds most human capabilities, in fact? This is the challenge of researching the medieval Middle East. While I was working on my dissertation 15 years ago, the only solution was to go to separate Orientalist reference works for each scholarly subfield, such as Brockelmann's Geschichte der arabischen Literatur, Georg Graf's Geschichte der christlichen arabischen Literatur, because that's different, of course, Baumstark's Geschichte der syrischen Literatur, Robert Thompson's Bibliography of Classical Armenian Literature and its supplement, and Beck's and Hunger's volumes on religious and secular Byzantine literature, respectively. Now, many medieval texts remain untranslated, so from the very terse information provided in these surveys about authors, dates, regions, and titles, one simply had to guess which texts might be useful to read, and therefore which languages might be worth learning to complete one's study. The appearance of searchable text corpora has made it easier to locate relevant texts, but only if you happen to know how to spell a particular name in each of the different scripts that are used. And most languages do not yet have massive corpora, like Simtho for Syriac or Open Islamic Text Initiative for Arabic. Now, wouldn't it be lovely if we had a tool that would let you search for a topic in any language, and it would give you references for relevant primary sources in any language? We do not have that tool, but I designed the Historical Index of the Medieval Middle East, or HIMME, so that it could increasingly grow into that role. Here, I will change to the browser. So let's talk about the opportunities and challenges of that design. There are 3 different genres of entries in HIMME, one for people, including groups of people, one for places, and one for what I'm terming practices, which is almost a catch-all term for features of culture and society. I will not say much about the technical back end of the project during the talk, but I'm happy to discuss in Q&A the TEI XML structures and the XSL and Perl scripts if anyone is interested. Now, unlike my earlier work on Syriaca.org, for any of you familiar with that project, HIMME indexes primary sources rather than secondary literature. And it has also prioritized neglected primary sources rather than the mainstay sources that historians have typically prioritized. Here's the About page, which includes a list of the current sources. So HIMME at present indexes primary sources in Arabic, Armenian, Greek, Hebrew, Latin, Persian, and Syriac, including translations where those exist. This list reflects the linguistic limitations of the team of people who have put it together. Here is the team. And I should take a moment to acknowledge that HIMME was not my work alone, but the product of teamwork, as you can see from this list of contributors, some of whom were remunerated by a grant from the National Endowment of the Humanities, others of whom contributed as volunteers. In addition to the sources currently in HIMME, I have various source indices in development, and this is my first public announcement of these forthcoming developments. One source that will soon be incorporated into HIMME is the Armenian history of Revond, which may be the earliest source composed under Muslim rule to describe the political history of the Umayyad and early Abbasid caliphates. It is contemporary with Muslim biographies of Muhammad, but earlier than Muslim histories of the caliphs. Another source in development is the Syriac travel account and joint biography of Rabban Salma and Maria Balaha. They traveled from China to Iraq in the 13th century, participated in Mongol diplomacy with Latin Europe, and observed the Islamization of the Ilkhanate. And I have a translation of that coming out in the fall with Hackett Press. I'm looking at including other sources, like the Greek Chronicle of Theophanes Confessor, the Arabic history of Ibn Taghlibirdi, and the Persian Jami' al-Tawarikh of Rashiduddin Hamadani as possible sources for future inclusion. Of course, it must be stressed that this index is not comprehensive and never will be, because indexing all the extant primary sources from the medieval Middle East would take all scholars working full-time for more than their lifetimes, and that is not going to happen. But this project is designed to grow and incorporate new data, and if anyone would like to contribute the index of a primary source, please contact me. I'll say more about that later. So what does this structure allow us to do? So let's say if you're interested in the famous 12th century Muslim ruler Salahuddin, known to crusaders as Saladin, you probably know that you need to look at Arabic and Latin sources. Oh, but here's a Syriac source for you. The Chronicle of Michael the Syrian. If you are interested in the Byzantine Navy, go up to the search box again. And we have an entry for the Byzantine Navy, and you might not have thought to look at the 11th century travel account in Persian of Nasri Khusro, which fortunately has been translated into English in case Byzantinists don't happen to include Persian in their repertoire. The same source, travel account of Nasri Khusro, happens to mention, incidentally, a person by the name of Abu Sa'id, who is a Jewish jeweler in Egypt, reportedly close to the Fatimid Caliph al-Mustansar Billah, and who bankrolled him. The Jewish traveler Benjamin of Tudela gives extensive information on the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, who died in 1180. See 3 citations. Benjamin's travel account includes mentioning specific offices and titles, such as the Eparch of Constantinople, in a Hebrew source. Historians of Timur Lang, known in Older English as Tamerlane, will find extensive information, including dozens of references in Armenian colophons and whole books dedicated to Timur in the Greek history of Laonikos Chalkokandilis. Timurid historians don't typically read Greek, but fortunately, again, this has been translated into English. And a scholar who might be interested, for example, in the history of the Muslim month of fasting, Ramadan, can find descriptions not only in Arabic, but also in Armenian, Greek, Hebrew, and Syriac sources. This does not merely provide additional sources, but sources from additional literary traditions, an important distinction, which often represent different social positions, different patronage structures, and sometimes different religious perspectives or cultural assumptions. In other words, the plurality of sources is not merely quantitatively more, although that is worthwhile, but also qualitatively different, allowing researchers to triangulate among medieval perspectives and avoid some of the pitfalls shared among sources within only one tradition. Another opportunity provided by this data set is the possibility of finding earlier sources closer to the events described by crossing linguistic boundaries. I already mentioned the Armenian history of Revond earlier, which gives an earlier description of events which are mostly known to scholars through the later works of al-Baladhari, al-Tabari, and others. But that's not the only example. The entry for the famous Mongol conqueror Genghis Khan includes a reference in Yakut's geographical dictionary, which Yakut was probably writing while Genghis Khan was still alive. Yakut also included recent reports of crusader movements in his dictionary. So in order to facilitate this kind of analysis, where you try and find out which sources are closer to the events and which are further away, HIMME is designed to record a bunch of chronological data about these references. This isn't the clearest. This is the temporal data. Let me zoom out just a little bit, which will show, and you can see that there's a legend on the right. And so for each of the references, we try and include some temporal data about the events described, the composition date, the earliest manuscript for the text, and the date of the edition used. And the tool allows, if you have lots of sources, allows filtering and sorting this information, especially important for famous places like Constantinople or Jerusalem, for which we have hundreds of citations, which span centuries of different sources, and scholars may not be interested in every century. But there's also a challenge in working with this chronological data, and that is to ask, when is the information actually from? Now, Yakut's reference to Genghis Khan must be recent, because the events were so close to when he was writing. But in many other entries, Yakut reports the conditions of a place without making clear whether he has any recent information or whether he is instead taking the description from a written source centuries earlier. For example, Yakut frequently uses the travel account of Ibn Fadlan, 300 years before he was writing. So it is important to include the ability to label ranges of uncertainty in this sort of temporal model, but even so, this framework does not capture literary relationships. This lacuna of information is a problem, of course. It provides a pitfall for scholars, but it also potentially fails to inform scholars of opportunities to see earlier sources. So, for example, the early 9th century Islamic judge, Yahya bin Aktham, is mentioned both in Yakut's geographical dictionary and in Michael the Syrian's somewhat earlier Syriac chronicle. However, this framework will not tell you that Michael's account is here quoting, seemingly verbatim, from the account of his 9th century predecessor Dionysius of Tel Machre, in which Dionysius described meeting the Muslim judge Yahya ibn Aktham at the court of al-Ma'mun. Therefore, Michael preserves an eyewitness account here. But I have not figured out how to represent this detail of literary relationship within this project. And this provides a good transition to talking about other challenges which face the development of HIMME, some of which I have solved to my own satisfaction anyway, others of which I have not. One immediate problem particularly faces polyglot projects like this one. How does one pick headwords? In monolingual projects, the headword can in most cases be the most common way of referring to the topic in the target language, an approach adopted by both Syriaca.org and the Encyclopedia of Islam. Then only a relatively small number of entries cause trouble by virtue of having multiple names. But for a polyglot project like this one, should the metropolis on the Bosporus be called Constantinople, as in English? or Constantinopolis, as in Greek, or Al-Qustantiniya, as in Arabic and Persian, or Istanbul, its modern name in all these languages. Istanbul was also a colloquial name for the city in the medieval period, already attested in Arabic in the 10th century. You can see that the entry is here labeled Constantinople, favoring English usage. The conqueror, known in Older English as Tamerlane, is spelled Timur-Lenk in Arabic, Timur-Lang, or just Timur in Persian, Timur or Timur-Lenk in Turkish, as well as Timeres in Greek, and many variations of Lang Timur in Armenian. And these are only the famous ones, but one can find far less famous people in places for which no English scholarly form is standardized, but whose multiple names still reflect the multilingual environment. If we select some language rather than others, or pick one headword from a prioritized list of languages, we downplay the polyglot dynamic of the medieval Middle East. But on the other hand, it is simply impracticable to include all of the languages of Constantinople or Timur into the headword itself. So on the one hand, I tried to pick the headwords that make the most sense for each subfield of scholarship most likely to be interested in each entry, although some favoritism is no doubt inevitable in such an approach. On the other hand, I designed HIMME to try to take the pressure off the headword as a normative spelling by thinking about the purposes for which headwords are used. One purpose, of course, is citation, for which brevity is the soul of wit. So down at the bottom, there's a suggestion how to cite this entry. But for users seeking to learn what a place or person was called in a variety of different languages, it is important to display all of the options, which is why each entry displays the different languages prominently. So there's Timur's list, and the longer list of Constantinople keeps going for quite a while. This incidentally also tells users how to spell the place names in the various alphabets, which can be used to search in textual corpora, for example. Entry headwords are also used in search functionality. And so we enabled search to be performed in any language. So for example, here I will search for Constantinia. And you see there are two hits, one of which is the famous city. Some wildcard functionality permits spelling variation. We display some hits with the search result list to help users pick the results most relevant to them. The next update will also include abstracts in the results list, which are brief descriptions of the subject of an entry, although many entries have abstracts that are somewhat vague or even placeholders awaiting future elaboration. Headwords are also used for browsing, such as, when you have a print book and you're looking at the index, you're sort of skimming through the entries just to see what it contains. So we enabled browse functionality. Let's see, where is browse functionality? Across the whole data set of names in any language. You can browse in Arabic, Armenian, Greek, Hebrew, Latin, Syriac, Farsi, or Persian. So this is all to enable us to avoid the pitfalls of having put all of our eggs in one basket and choosing just one name as the headword. Another large challenge for this project revolves around the seemingly simple question: when two references in two different texts are talking about the same person, place, or practice. There are many facets to this challenge. We all know that the same name can be used of different people, as, for example, the name Professor Thomas A. Carlson may refer to me, or to a philosopher of religion at the University of California, Santa Barbara, or to a psychology professor at the University of Sydney in Australia. We are not all the same person. Mohammed is a good candidate for the most popular male name in human history. And not just people. The Geographical Dictionary of Yaqut al-Hamawi includes more than a dozen. Sorry, just a sec. Yeah, the Geographical Dictionary of Yaqut al-Hamawi enumerates more than a dozen different cities named Alexandria, because the famous Alexander certainly got around and was obsessed with founding cities. On one level, the existence of shared names indicates the value of an index over a concordance, as HIMME disambiguates which Muhammad or which Alexandria is being discussed in each particular passage. Incidentally, this also shows why indexing is an art and not susceptible to full automation, so be sure to pay your indexers. Some kinds of shared names can be disambiguated by other information. For example, it is very common for regions to be named after their main city, or vice versa, and for provinces to share names with regions. And so for this purpose, go over to documentation. We developed place types initially for Syriaca.org to try to navigate some of this complexity, and HIMME has adopted the place types from Syriaca.org and then expanded upon them. But of course, once you have these place types, that introduces other complexities. So for example, because governments divide their territory into provinces to govern regions, but on the other hand, the provinces sometimes change their boundaries without reference to common notions of the extent of the corresponding region, we found it useful to distinguish between province and region as types. And so you can see province and region are separated here. Likewise, Christian dioceses are distinguished both from provinces and regions and also from cities that they're often named after. On the other hand, we did not find it possible, either for Syriaca.org or for HIMME, to distinguish among cities, towns, villages, and metropolises. Because places grow and shrink continuously over time while retaining their identity, and sometimes, even at the same moment, one author will refer to a place as a city while another calls it a village. We embraced this ambiguity by calling any such conglomeration of houses a settlement. We also found it impossible to distinguish between lakes and ponds on the one hand, or between lakes and seas on the other. One, we might think of the Lake of Tiberias, also known as the Sea of Galilee, at the same time. So all such formations are called open water. Place types also enable certain kinds of research to go on. So if we go back to the browse page and we browse places, you might have noticed that there is this option to browse by type. For example, if you're interested in which mosques are referred to in these primary sources, you can click on mosque and it will give you a list. Or if you're interested in mountains and mountain passes, it is also possible to browse people by gender, and this enables gender research in this corpus. Sorry, not corpus, in this data set. But the difficulty of establishing identity of subject between textual references is even more slippery than that. Less famous people sometimes appear in texts only by one name, which might be a common name, or they might be referenced by a title or a function they performed without even indicating their name. This is often not enough information to provide a precise identification with someone else mentioned in a different source. On the other hand, very famous people often inspire legendary alternative biographies, such as a slanderous Armenian source which claims that the most famous Muhammad was born in the city of Rai in northern Iran, and he later founded the city of Baghdad, even though we, in fact, know that he was born in Mecca, in Arabia, and that Baghdad was not founded until more than a century after his death. So is this a reference to the famous Muhammad, or is it not? Among places, we have some other difficulties, such as when a city was founded on a specific date as the act of a particular ruler, with trumpets blaring, but the site included the site of an earlier village, as happened in the cases both of Baghdad and Constantinople. So is the city that was founded on this date the same or different as the preceding village? Or sometimes a city was founded right nearby, maybe across a river from a preceding city, and then grew to encompass that earlier city, as that happened both with Mosul, which encompassed Nineveh, and with Cairo in Egypt, which encompassed Fustat. Or sometimes a city is destroyed and abandoned for a time, but then reoccupied. Is the new settlement the same or different from the preceding? In a few cases, cities even moved. When the Mamluk Empire of Egypt conquered the Crusader states in the late 13th century, they destroyed the port cities of Tyre and Acre, but Tripoli, they moved inland a few kilometers to a completely different site. Is this new foundation the same as the older Tripoli? Medieval authors were so ignorant that they did not specify GIS coordinates or DNA sequences to identify places and people. That's a joke, of course. We medievalists are accustomed to dealing with texts which operate within medieval, not modern, assumptions and modes of communication, but this leads to ambiguities that we do need to deal with. And so to deal with these ambiguities, HIMME builds upon an approach pioneered by the Pleiades Project for Ancient Geography. Tom Elliott and Sean Gillies argued that texts do not give us geometrical specifications of sites, but rather they point us to the concepts of places. If texts tell us that the city of Tripoli moved in 1289, that means that the city at the new site was, according to medieval authors, in some sense the same as the earlier city. If, on the other hand, counterfactually, the Mamluk conquerors had destroyed Tripoli and then had founded a different site, a different city rather, at the other site nearby, had given that new city a new name, that would have indicated that medieval people thought of the two sites as separate places, as not the same. Therefore, the place records in HIMME, as in Pleiades, are not records of particular sites or footprints of places, but instead are records of named concepts, which could correspond with a range of different physical realities that were considered identical. This approach allows us to identify references to the same region in different authors, even if those authors would have given different definitions of the region's boundaries. So, for example, medieval geographers agreed that Iraq was the name of the lower valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, but how far up the rivers is the region still Iraq? And at what point should we instead call it Al Jazeera, the medieval Arabic name for Upper Mesopotamia? Different geographers give divergent answers, all of them further south than the current northern border of the nation-state of Iraq, but because they all share a concept of Iraq as the lower valley of the Tigris and Euphrates River, including Basra and Baghdad, we are able to have one entry for the region of Iraq and include the names which medieval authors provide as alternatives, such as, in Armenian, the land of the Babylonians, or the biblical Shinar in Hebrew and Syriac. So this conceptual approach to identification expands also to groups, where we face the difficulty of the slippage between the individual people who compose a group, which may change over time, and the putative character of the group itself. Two groups may overlap largely, even mostly, in membership, or indeed one group might be a portion of a larger group. It is even possible to imagine two different named groups that for a period of time might have identical membership, which suggests that the identity of the group is more than merely the sum of the members. Fortunately, my first book developed the notion of community concepts, examining precisely this conceptual dimension of collective social life, which allows HIMME to identify group names when they are translated from one language to another, or when another term is used explicitly synonymously, but to differentiate, HIMME can differentiate among closely related groups whose concept is somewhat different. So, for example, common Armenian terms used for Muslims are all derogatory, including Hagarenes, Ishmaelites, Tajiks, and foreigners, Aylazgik. The last, of course, is much broader and includes the biblical Philistines, while the first two, Hagarenes and Ishmaelites, specifically refer to the notion that Arabs are descended from the biblical Hagar and Ishmael, a concept which turns up in various languages. But of course, we must distinguish this hostile name for Muslims from Muslims' own use of the related term etymologically, Ismaili, which refers not to the biblical Ishmael, but to a division of the Shia. A conceptual approach to the identification of individual persons helps us cope with erroneous data and even legendary embellishments. For example, reports of miracles attributed to various saints, some of whom were real people, some perhaps not. These can simply be included as part of the concept of this particular individual. Sometimes there are legendary conflations of separate individuals, of course, in which case we can put the primary source references into each of the conflated entries on the principle that they might be interesting to scholars interested in any of the various subjects that have become conflated. A conceptual approach to practices means that we can include any social or cultural concept employed within the medieval Middle East, such as, again, Ramadan, and the various translations used without getting into the nitty-gritty as to whether the Ramadan practices in Egypt are indistinguishable from the Ramadan practices in Iran, or the ways in which Ramadan practices changed over time. There was a concept of the Muslim month of fasting that was shared between Egypt and Iran despite any differences in practice. Where there were distinct customs for Ramadan associated with a particular locale or time, such customs can receive their own separate practice entries, allowing any scholars interested in the differences to trace them in the sources. In general, HIMME's development was guided by the principle of discoverability, making visible to researchers what might interest them about this topic and encouraging the use of the search box to find related entries. Now, another pair of challenges confront not only HIMME, but all digital projects in the form of questions about stability and sustainability. So I'll go back to my slideshow. Many digital humanities projects start with a bang and good funding, but unless they are led by a faculty member at a wealthy private institution which promises sustaining technical assistance over the long term, then once the grant funding runs dry, the projects soon run into technical difficulties which exceed the project director's technical know-how. I do not have access to those levels of institutional support. And even projects at such wealthy private institutions often face significant downtime when one or another part of the technology stack fails. So from the beginning, my goal has been to find ways to keep the project running with my own funding and in-house technical skills. Therefore, I learned how to code XML and XSLT, but the entries themselves are simply text files on a file system, on the server, at the domain that we rent, and also mirrored on GitHub in case anyone wants to download all of the data. So unless our domain hosting service goes offline, the website continues to be usable. In order to search HTML pages without requiring a relational database to be loaded and kept in active memory, which can crash either on the server or on the client, we use static search, which was developed by Project Endings at the University of Victoria, and it's easy to customize and deploy. There is no software to crash or even to update beyond updates to the data. And here I would credit Alison Langmead at the University of Pittsburgh, who proposes that digital projects should plan for about 3 years into the future in order to maintain their viability. The simplicity of the technology required and the affordability of our domain hosting mean that I can maintain HIMME without institutional support, although further programmatic development would likely require additional funding. And the most fundamental challenge for all digital projects is that data gathering and curation is hard work. Creating a useful index for one moderately sized primary source is an extremely time-intensive undertaking, to say nothing of creating 9 independent indices, which is what HIMME unified. For that reason, HIMME has favored primary sources that are already indexed and merely united existing indices, despite the inevitable unevenness of the source data, and we can talk about the challenges that that posed in Q&A if anyone is interested. Sometimes when an existing index has entries which do not distinguish, for example, a region and a city with the same name, it has been necessary to consult the primary source in order to separate out the references. I try to keep that to a minimum, but sometimes it's necessary. Several indices which were included in HIMME were published in print, and we used optical character recognition, OCR, to create digital files, but that, of course, introduces typographical errors. So it requires proofreading, which takes more time, and is also a lossy process. One doesn't proofread perfectly. So where possible, in order to avoid data corruption of this kind, HIMME has preferred to work with digital files provided by translators or editors or publishers, including Gorgias Press, for which I thank George Kiraz. But even with a perfectly digitized index, aligning a new index against a dataset of around 40,000 entries is time-consuming work. And with no present grant funding, we are unable to pay workers to do the data entry. For that reason, this talk ends, like so many digital humanities talks do, with a pitch. Here is the tool, HIMME, which is made available online for free to anyone, anywhere in the world, in order to make it easier to research the medieval Middle East in all of its crazy diversity. And if you would like to make the tool better for everyone by contributing data from a new primary source, I am happy to provide training and consultation and to include your work in a future update of HIMME once the submission is of sufficient quality. And whether you contribute or not, the tool is available for everyone to use. And I thank you all for your attention. I welcome your questions and discussion.